On December 2nd, 1742, a woman sat alone in the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. Outside, the Russian winter had already set in, the Neva River frozen solid, the city her father had built from nothing blanketed in snow. She had seized the throne just 1 year earlier, marching into the imperial chambers at midnight with a silver cross clutched in her hand and 300 soldiers at her back. She had promised God that if she became empress, she would never sign a death sentence. And she kept that promise. For 20 years, not a single execution order would bear her signature. Criminals would be beaten, exiled to Siberia, have their nostrils slit with hot pincers, but they would not be killed. Elizabeth Petrovna was a woman of her word when it came to God. But on this December morning, the Empress signed something else. A decree that would uproot tens of thousands of people from their homes, scatter them across the frozen borderlands, and set in motion a chain of events that would echo through Russian history for the next 2 centuries. A decree that contained 6 words she wrote in her own hand, words that would become infamous, words that would define Russia's relationship with an entire people for generations to come. The decree ordered the expulsion of every Jew from the Russian Empire. When her own Senate, the highest governing body beneath the throne itself, begged her to reconsider, warning that the empire's trade would collapse, that merchants in Riga were already panicking, that the economic damage would be catastrophic, that the treasury would lose revenue it desperately needed, Elizabeth picked up her pen and wrote in the margin of their report 6 words in her own hand. "I do not wish any profit from the enemies of Christ." With those words, approximately 35,000 men, women, and children were condemned to leave everything they had built and start over somewhere else. With those words, a policy that had simmered for centuries crystallized into absolute law. With those words, Elizabeth Petrovna made her position clear. There would be no Jews in Russia. Not for commerce, not for any reason, not while she drew breath. This is the story of why that happened, but to understand it, we need to go back much further than 1742. We need to go back nearly 1,000 years, to a time when the very lands that would become Russia were home to one of the earliest Jewish communities in Eastern Europe. We need to understand the fears and the hatreds that built up over centuries. We need to trace the policies of czars and empresses, the theological debates of Orthodox churchmen, the economic anxieties of Russian merchants, and the personal convictions of a woman who believed she was doing God's work. Because the expulsion of 1742 wasn't an isolated act of religious hatred, a momentary fit of bigotry by a zealous ruler. It was the culmination of centuries of fear, suspicion, theological anxiety, and a uniquely Russian obsession with religious purity that would shape the lives of millions for generations to come. It was the logical endpoint of a worldview that saw Jews not merely as different, but as dangerous. Not merely as outsiders, but as enemies. This is the story of Russia and its Jews. It is a story of walls built and borders closed. It is a story of expelled communities and shattered lives. It is a story that begins with a letter written 1,000 years ago and ends with the largest Jewish population in the world, confined to a narrow strip of territory called the Pale of Settlement. And it begins, as so many stories do, with an unexpected discovery. In 1962, a scholar named Norman Golb was working in the Cambridge University Library, hunched over a desk in the manuscript reading room, examining fragments from the Cairo Geniza. The Geniza was one of the greatest treasure troves of medieval documents ever discovered. For centuries, the Jewish community of Fustat in Old Cairo had deposited their worn-out documents, their letters and contracts and religious texts, in a storeroom attached to the Ben Ezra synagogue. Jewish law forbade the destruction of any document containing the name of God. So instead of throwing papers away, the community simply stored them, and stored them, and stored them some more. By the time European scholars discovered the Geniza in the late 19th century, it contained roughly 300,000 manuscript fragments spanning nearly 1,000 years of Jewish history. letters from merchants trading across the Mediterranean, marriage contracts from communities long vanished, religious commentaries and philosophical treatises, personal correspondence and business records, a window into a lost world. Golb was examining one of these fragments when he noticed something unusual. It was a letter written in Hebrew, clearly medieval in origin. But as he translated the text, he found a word that made him pause, a word that, as far as anyone knew, had never appeared in any document this old. That word was Kiev. The letter, now known to scholars as the Kievan letter, dates to approximately 930 CE. That makes it the oldest original document in any language to mention the city of Kiev. Not a Russian chronicle written centuries later. Not a Byzantine record copied and recopied by monks. An actual letter written by actual people, living in an actual community more than 1,000 years ago. Think about what that means for a moment. Before Russia existed as a nation, before the princes of Moscow had begun their slow accumulation of power, before the Mongol invasions that would reshape the entire region, Jews were already living in Kiev. They had a community. They had institutions. They had connections to other Jewish communities across the known world. They were not newcomers or refugees. They were established residents of a city that would one day become the heart of Russian civilization. The document itself tells a poignant story. It was written by the Jewish community of Kiev on behalf of a man named Jacob ben Hanukkah. Jacob had faced a terrible situation. His brother had been taken captive, probably by raiders or bandits, and was being held for ransom. Jacob borrowed money from non-Jewish lenders to pay the ransom and free his brother. He succeeded, but now he himself was in debt. Then disaster struck again. Jacob was traveling when he was attacked by bandits and robbed of everything he had. Now he couldn't repay his loans. Under the laws of the time, a debtor who couldn't pay could be imprisoned, even enslaved. The Jewish community of Kiev had already contributed what they could to help him, but it wasn't enough. So they wrote this letter, asking other Jewish communities along the trade routes to help one of their own. The letter was meant to travel with Jacob as he journeyed from community to community, proving that his story was true and that he was worthy of charity. It bears the signatures of the community's leaders, their names affixed to the bottom of the document as witnesses to Jacob's plight. And those signatures reveal something remarkable. Mixed in with traditional Hebrew names are names like Kiebar, Sawarta, Manas, and Gostata. These aren't Hebrew names at all. They're Turkic and Slavic. Some scholars believe these names indicate that the Jewish community of Kiev included converts, possibly descendants of the Khazars, like a powerful Turkic people whose ruling class had famously converted to Judaism in the 8th century. The Khazar Khaganate had controlled vast territories north of the Caucasus and the Black Sea. And though the empire had collapsed by the time the Kievan letter was written, some of its Jewish population may have migrated to nearby cities like Kiev. Whether or not the Khazar theory is true, the Kievan letter proves beyond doubt that Jews were present in the region we now call Russia from the very beginning of recorded history there. They weren't interlopers or infiltrators. They were part of the original fabric of society. By the 11th century, this Jewish presence had become substantial enough to shape the very geography of Kiev itself. The city had a distinct Jewish quarter called Zidove, a name derived from the Slavic word for Jew. The quarter was significant enough that one of the city's 3 main gates, major architectural landmarks in a medieval city, was named for it. The Zhidivsky Gate, the Jewish Gate, stood as a permanent marker of Jewish presence in the city's landscape. Jewish merchants in Kiev facilitated trade along the routes that connected the Byzantine Empire in the south to the Baltic Sea in the north, and from the Islamic lands in the east to the emerging kingdoms of Western Europe. They dealt in furs and slaves, in honey and wax, in amber and silver. They were middlemen in a vast commercial network that spanned the known world. Their linguistic skills, their family connections spread across different lands. Their experience with long-distance commerce all made them valuable participants in the medieval economy. But this coexistence This ordinary world of Jewish life in the lands that would become Russia was always precarious, always conditional, always dependent on the goodwill of rulers and the tolerance of neighbors. Always one crisis, one accusation, one bad harvest or military defeat away from catastrophe. In 1113, that catastrophe came to Kiev. Prince Sviatopolk II had just died. He had been an unpopular ruler, blamed for military failures against the nomadic Cumans and for economic policies that had enriched his favorites while impoverishing ordinary people. When news of his death spread through Kiev, the accumulated resentments of years boiled over into violence. The mob that formed had many targets. They attacked the homes of Sviatopolk's officials. They looted the residences of wealthy boyars who had prospered under his rule. But they also turned their fury on the Jewish quarter. In the eyes of the rioters, Jewish financiers and merchants were part of the system that had oppressed them. Jewish moneylenders had collected debts. Jewish traders had profited while ordinary people struggled. The violence was severe. Homes and businesses were destroyed. People were beaten, possibly killed. The Jewish community that had existed in Kiev for at least 2 centuries was devastated in a matter of days. When Vladimir II Monomach arrived to take the throne his cousin Sviatopolk had vacated, he faced a choice. He could protect the Jews and restore order, or he could side with the mob. According to later chronicles, he chose the latter. The Jews were expelled from Kiev. Historians debate how complete or long-lasting this expulsion actually was. White medieval chronicles are not always reliable, and rulers who claimed to expel populations didn't always succeed in doing so. Jews may have returned to Kiev relatively quickly, or some may have remained in hiding throughout. But the pattern established in 1113 would repeat itself again and again across the centuries of Russian and Eastern European history. When times were good, Jews were tolerated, even welcomed, for the economic services they provided. They lent money when the church forbade Christians from charging interest. They traded goods across long distances when few others had the networks to do so. They filled niches in the economy that needed filling. But when times turned bad, when crops failed or wars went poorly or plagues struck, Jews became convenient scapegoats. The same economic activities that had made them useful, or lending money and collecting debts, became evidence of their villainy. The same separateness that had allowed them to maintain their distinct identity became proof of their disloyalty, and the violence that followed was often devastating. Then came the Mongols. Between 1237 and 1240, the armies of Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, swept through the lands of Russes like a wave of destruction. City after city fell. Ryazan was destroyed in December 1237, its entire population massacred or enslaved. Vladimir fell in February 1238. Moscow, then just a small fortress town, was burned. The Mongol armies seemed unstoppable. Kiev, the ancient capital, the mother of Russian cities, held out until December 1240. When it finally fell, the destruction was almost total. But a European traveler who passed through 6 years later reported that the once great city had been reduced to barely 200 houses, with countless skulls and bones scattered across the surrounding fields. The population had been killed, fled, or enslaved. The Jewish community of Kiev was caught in this catastrophe along with everyone else. Those who could fled westward, toward Poland and Lithuania, lands that the Mongols had not conquered. Those who couldn't flee faced the same fate as their Christian neighbors: death, slavery, or desperate survival amid the ruins. The Mongol conquest reshaped the entire region. For the next 2.5 centuries, the lands of Russes were divided and subjugated, paying tribute to the Khans of the Golden Horde. The Principality of Moscow slowly accumulated power, or eventually emerging as the dominant force and the successor to the Mongol overlords. But the Jewish communities that had existed before the conquest were scattered, diminished, and in many cases simply gone. When Russia began to re-emerge as a unified state under the Grand Princes of Moscow, the question of Jews arose again. And this time, the answer would be shaped by an event that occurred in the late 15th century, an event that would poison Russian attitudes toward Jews for the next 500 years. It was called the heresy of the Judaizers. And whether it was real or imagined, exaggerated or fabricated, it became the lens through which Russian rulers viewed Jews for centuries to come. Around 1470 or 1471, a man arrived in the city of Novgorod in northwestern Russia. His name was Zachariah, or sometimes rendered as Skaria in the Russian sources. He was a Jewish scholar from Kiev, traveling in the retinue of a Lithuanian prince named Michael Olelkovich, who had been invited to Novgorod for political reasons. What happened during Zachariah's time in Novgorod is still debated by historians. The only accounts we have come from the heresy's opponents, Orthodox churchmen who were determined to stamp it out and who had every reason to exaggerate or distort what actually occurred. According to these hostile sources, Zachariah began teaching, and some of what he taught attracted the attention of Orthodox priests. Two priests in particular, Denis and Alexius, supposedly became his disciples. They abandoned Christian doctrines, questioned the divinity of Christ, rejected the veneration of icons, adopted Jewish practices like observing the Sabbath, and began spreading their new beliefs to others. The heresy, as the church called it, spread from Novgorod to Moscow. It attracted followers among the educated classes, among the aristocracy, even among people with connections to the Grand Prince himself. Fyodor Kurutsyn, the state secretary of Ivan III, was accused of being a Judaizer. So was Elena, the daughter-in-law of Ivan III himself, the wife of his heir, and the mother of his grandson. The heresy, whether real or imagined, had reached into the very heart of Russian power. Archbishop Gennady of Novgorod led the investigation into the heresy. He was appalled by what he found, or claimed to find. He wrote letters to other church officials describing the threat in the most alarming terms. These weren't just confused Christians who had picked up some Jewish ideas. They were, in Gennady's telling, part of a deliberate Jewish conspiracy to undermine Orthodox Christianity from within. And in his proposals for dealing with the heretics, Gennady explicitly cited the Spanish Inquisition as a model. He had obtained accounts of how Ferdinand and Isabella were handling Jews and heretics in Spain, and he recommended that Russia follow their example. The same Inquisition that was, at that very moment, preparing to expel every Jew from Spain. For years, the matter remained unresolved. Ivan III was reluctant to move against the accused heretics, some of whom were his own officials and relatives. But in 1504, a church council finally met in Moscow to decide the matter. The council condemned the heresy and ordered executions. Ivan Kurutsyn, the brother of the state secretary, was among those burned alive, reportedly in a cage or a specially constructed wooden structure. Others were imprisoned, exiled, or forced to publicly recant. The heresy of the Judaizers was suppressed, but its legacy endured for centuries. Now, historians today are deeply divided about what actually happened. Some believe there really was a movement influenced by Jewish ideas, though probably nothing like the organized conspiracy the church described. Others think the whole affair was largely invented or exaggerated, a weapon used by one faction of the church against another, with Jews serving as convenient bogeymen. The truth is probably somewhere in between, but we may never know for certain. What matters for our story is not whether the heresy was real, but that the Russian church believed it was real, and that belief became embedded in Russian religious and political culture for the next 500 years. The fear of Jewish proselytizing, the terror that Jews might somehow corrupt true Christians and lead them away from the faith, became a permanent feature of Russian thinking about Jews. It wasn't enough to merely exclude Jews from Russian territory. Jews were actively dangerous. They were missionaries of a rival faith, always seeking to win converts, always trying to undermine Christianity from within. A single Jew in this worldview could contaminate an entire community. Every subsequent Russian ruler who considered policy toward Jews did so with a Judaizers' heresy lurking in the background. The case of Zechariah, whether he actually did anything wrong or not, became the template for understanding what Jews were and what they wanted. They were not merely different. They were enemies. Enemies of Christ, enemies of the Church, enemies of Russia itself. This fear would reach its ultimate expression in Elizabeth's decree of 1742. But first, we need to understand what was happening across Russia's borders while Russia itself was building these walls of exclusion. Because just across the border, in the lands of Poland and Lithuania, something very different was taking place. Jews were finding something they had rarely known in European history, a place where they could live in relative peace, a place where they could build communities and institutions, a place that, for all its imperfections, was willing to let them be, a home. In 1264, a Polish prince named Bolesław the Pious ruled the region of Greater Poland, centered on the city of Kalisz. Poland at this time was not yet a unified kingdom, but a collection of duchies and principalities, often squabbling with each other but sharing a common language and culture. Bolesław was looking for ways to develop his territory, to attract settlers and merchants who could help his economy grow. He turned his attention to the Jews. Jews had been present in Poland for at least a century, but their legal status was uncertain. They existed on the sufferance of local rulers, without clear rights or protections. Bolesław decided to change that. He issued a document known as the Statute of Kalisz, and it became the foundation of Jewish life in Poland for the next 500 years. The statute granted Jews in Bolesław's territory a comprehensive set of rights and protections, unlike anything else in medieval Europe. Jews received the right to travel freely through the prince's lands. They could engage in trade and money lending without restriction. They were exempted from certain taxes and tolls. They had their own courts to settle disputes among themselves, according to their own laws and customs. Perhaps most remarkably, the statute provided protections against the kinds of accusations that had led to massacres elsewhere in Europe. If a Christian accused a Jew of a crime, the accuser needed both Christian and Jewish witnesses to prove the case. This made it far harder to fabricate charges. The blood libel, the vicious accusation that Jews murdered Christian children to use their blood in religious rituals, was explicitly addressed. The statute declared that such accusations required the testimony of 3 Christian and 3 Jewish witnesses, a nearly impossible standard that effectively immunized Jews from this particular form of persecution. Violence against Jews was punished severely. The fine for murdering a Jew was the same as for murdering a nobleman. Attacking a Jewish synagogue was treated the same as attacking a church. The message was clear. Jews in Bolesław's territory were under the protection of the law, and anyone who harmed them would pay a heavy price. The Statute of Kalisz wasn't perfect, and it wasn't universally applied. Jews still faced restrictions. They couldn't hold certain offices. They couldn't own land in most circumstances. They weren't truly equal to Christians in every respect. Other Polish rulers didn't always respect the statute's provisions, and local populations sometimes ignored them entirely. But compared to what Jews experienced almost everywhere else in Europe, Poland, under the Statute of Kalisz, was a sanctuary. It was a place where Jews could live, work, raise families, and practice their religion without constant fear of expulsion or massacre. And Jews noticed. Over the following centuries, as disasters struck Jewish communities across Western and Central Europe, the survivors often headed east, toward Poland, toward Lithuania, toward the one corner of the Christian world that seemed willing to let them live. In 1290, King Edward I of England expelled all Jews from his kingdom, ending a presence that had lasted more than 2 centuries. Between 3,000 and 16,000 people, depending on which estimates you trust, were forced to leave. Many headed to France. But France itself would expel its Jews repeatedly over the following century, with a final medieval expulsion coming in 1394. Each time, refugees scattered in search of safety. Then came 1492. The year Columbus sailed to the Americas is also remembered for something else, the Alhambra Decree, in which Ferdinand and Isabella ordered the expulsion of all Jews from Spain. Spain had been home to one of the largest and most accomplished Jewish communities in the world, producing scholars, poets, philosophers, and statesmen. Now they were given 4 months to convert to Christianity or leave. Estimates of how many Jews left Spain vary widely, from around 40,000 to as many as 200,000. Some converted and stayed, on becoming conversos, or new Christians, though many of these continued to practice Judaism in secret. Some went to Portugal, only to face forced conversion there a few years later. Some went to the Ottoman Empire, where the Sultan reportedly mocked Ferdinand for impoverishing Spain while enriching the Sultan's own domains. And some went to Poland. By the mid-17th century, the result of these centuries of migration was staggering. Roughly 3/4 of all the Jews in the entire world lived in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. One country, admittedly one of the largest in Europe, contained about 75% of the world's Jewish population. The numbers are remarkable. In the early 15th century, Poland-Lithuania had perhaps 10,000 to 24,000 Jews. By the official census of 1764, taken just before Poland's decline and partition, that number had grown to approximately 750,000. That was about 5 to 6% of the Commonwealth's total population, a proportion that would not be matched by Jews in any other country until the 20th century. And these weren't refugees huddled on the margins of society, barely surviving and constantly threatened. Polish Jews built something unprecedented in Jewish history, an entire parallel civilization with its own institutions, its own economy, its own culture, existing alongside and intertwined with Polish Christian society. They served as arrendators, a role unique to the Polish-Lithuanian system. Polish nobles owned vast estates, but often had no interest in managing them directly, so they leased the management to others, who would handle the day-to-day operations, collect rents from the peasants, run the mills and taverns and distilleries, and pay the noble a fixed sum while keeping any profits above that amount. Jews became specialists in this role. They managed estates across the Commonwealth, serving as intermediaries between noble landowners and peasant farmers. They ran the taverns where peasants came to drink and socialize. They operated the mills where grain was ground into flour. They collected the tolls at river crossings and the customs duties at border posts. They were, in effect, the managers of the Polish economy at the local level. This role brought prosperity but also danger. When times were good, everyone benefited. But when times were bad, when harvests failed or wars disrupted trade, the Jews who collected the rents and ran the taverns became convenient targets for resentment. They were the visible face of a system that, in bad times, seemed to grind the peasants down. Beyond their economic role, Polish Jews developed a remarkable degree of self-governance. The most important institution was the Council of Four Lands, known in Hebrew as the Va'ad Arba Aratzot. Founded around 1580, this was essentially a Jewish parliament, the first such institution since the ancient Sanhedrin. Representatives from the major Jewish communities across Poland gathered periodically, usually during the great fairs at Lublin or Jarosław, to conduct the business of Polish Jewry. They apportioned the taxes that the Jewish community owed to the crown, deciding how much each region and each community would pay. They legislated on religious and social matters, issuing regulations that had the force of law within the Jewish community. They settled disputes between communities and between individuals. They represented Jewish interests before the Polish king and the great nobles. The scholar Nathan Hanover, who lived through this era, compared the council's delegates to a little Sanhedrin, which ruled and led the Jews of Poland with a powerful hand. They had created, in effect, a state within a state, a Jewish polity existing inside the Polish Commonwealth, governing itself according to its own laws and traditions, while also participating in the broader Polish economy and society. Jewish, religious, and intellectual life flourished as never before. The yeshivas of Poland, the academies of Talmudic learning, became the most prestigious in the Jewish world. Students came from across Europe to study with the great rabbis of Krakow, Lublin, and Vilna. Scholars produced commentaries and legal codes that are still studied today. The Shulchan Aruch, the definitive code of Jewish law compiled by Joseph Caro in the 16th century, received its most important commentary, the Mappa, from Moses Isserles of Krakow, adapting the code for Ashkenazi Jewish practice. Hebrew printing presses churned out books by the thousands. Synagogues rose in cities and towns across the Commonwealth, some of them architectural masterpieces. Jewish craftsmen developed distinctive styles of art and metalwork. A vibrant Yiddish literature emerged, including songs, stories, and ethical works written in the everyday language of Polish Jews. This was the world that existed just across Russia's western border, a world where Jews weren't merely tolerated, but had become essential to the functioning of society. A world of relative prosperity and cultural flowering. A world that must have seemed to the Jews who lived in it like the closest thing to paradise they had known since the destruction of the ancient temple. And then, in 1648, that world was shattered. The man who shattered it was named Bohdan Khmelnitzky, and his name would become synonymous with catastrophe in Jewish memory. Khmelnitzky was a Cossack, a member of the semi-independent warrior communities that lived on the borderlands between the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Ottoman Empire. The Cossacks were a distinct people, neither fully Polish nor Russian nor Tatar, though they drew elements from all these cultures. They were Orthodox Christians, like the Russians, but they lived under Polish rule and chafed at the restrictions placed upon them. The Cossacks had many grievances. Polish nobles looked down on them. The Catholic Church tried to suppress their Orthodox faith. They were denied the political rights enjoyed by the Polish nobility, and increasingly they found themselves squeezed economically as Polish magnates expanded their control over the Ukrainian borderlands where the Cossacks lived. In 1648, Khmelnitzky, a minor Cossack officer who had his own personal grievances against a Polish nobleman, managed to unite the Cossacks and lead them in a massive uprising against Polish rule. He formed an alliance with the Crimean Tatars, adding their fearsome cavalry to his forces, and he marched against the Poles. His immediate targets were the Polish nobles and the Catholic clergy who represented Polish power in Ukraine. But the Jews quickly became targets too. As the visible managers of the nobles' estates, as the people who collected the rents and ran the taverns, as the intermediaries between Polish lords and Ukrainian peasants, Jews were associated with the very system the Cossacks were rebelling against. What followed was catastrophe on a scale that Polish Jewry had never experienced. Modern historians, working from fragmentary sources, estimate that somewhere between 18,000 and 50,000 Jews were killed during the Khmelnytsky uprising and the wars that followed it. Some older estimates ran much higher, into the hundreds of thousands, but these have been revised downward by modern scholarship. Even the lower figure, though, represents a staggering loss. 300 Jewish communities were destroyed completely. The massacres had names that burned themselves into Jewish collective memory, names that were recited in memorial prayers for centuries afterward. Nemiriv, where between 3,000 and 6,000 Jews died in June 1648, cut down by Cossack swords or drowned in the river while trying to flee. Tulsan, where the Polish garrison promised to protect the Jews, then surrendered them to the Cossacks in exchange for their own safety. Approximately 1,500 Jews perished. Polonnoy, where perhaps 10,000 were killed or captured and sold into slavery. Nathan Hanover, the same scholar who had praised the Council of Four Lands as a little Sanhedrin, also wrote a chronicle of the destruction. He called it Yevon Metzula, a phrase from Psalms meaning the deep mire or the miry pit. His descriptions of the violence are almost unbearable to read, even across a distance of nearly 4 centuries. He recorded communities that chose mass suicide rather than fall into Cossack hands, following the example of the Jews of ancient Masada. He described parents who killed their own children to spare them the torture and humiliation that capture would bring. He told of synagogues set ablaze with worshippers locked inside. He documented forced baptisms and forced marriages, Jews being made to renounce their faith at sword point. One particularly haunting passage describes the fate of the Jews of Nemirov. When the Cossacks approached the city, the Jews took refuge in the fortified area, expecting the defenses to hold. But some Cossacks dressed themselves in Polish uniforms and approached the gate, claiming to be friendly troops come to help. The Jews, deceived, opened the gates. What followed was slaughter, while the Khmelnitzky massacres left scars that never fully healed. They drove surviving Jews westward and northward, further concentrating Jewish population in certain areas. They intensified messianic longing, the desperate hope that the Messiah would finally come and end Jewish suffering. This longing would fuel the Sabbatai Zevi movement just a few years later, when a charismatic preacher from Smyrna convinced hundreds of thousands of Jews that he was the Messiah, before converting to Islam under pressure from the Ottoman Sultan and leaving his followers devastated. The massacres also left a deep trauma in Jewish collective memory. For centuries afterward, the Hebrew date of the beginning of the Khmelnytsky uprising, the 20th of Sivan, was observed as a fast day in many Jewish communities. The memory of 1648 became a reference point for all future catastrophes. Even the Holocaust, in its early stages, was sometimes compared by Jews to the events of 1648. But here's what matters for our story about Russia. After the uprising, after the violence, after the treaties that eventually ended the wars, the borders of Eastern Europe were redrawn. Through a complex series of conflicts and negotiations, Russia gained new territories in Ukraine, and with those territories came something Russia had never wanted and didn't know how to handle: Jews. Suddenly, the Russian Empire, which had spent centuries building walls to keep Jews out, had Jews within its borders. Not many, not yet. The bulk of the Jewish population remained in the parts of Poland-Lithuania that hadn't been annexed. But some Jewish communities now found themselves under Russian rule. The question of what to do about these Jews would consume Russian rulers for the next 3 centuries. It would lead to expulsions and restrictions, to ghettos and pogroms, to mass emigration and revolutionary movements. And it would eventually lead to a document signed on a December morning in 1742 with 6 words scrawled in the margin. But before we get to Elizabeth, we need to look at the century between the Khmelnytsky uprising and her reign, because the approach that Russia took toward Jews during that period, particularly under Elizabeth's own father, would set the stage for everything that came after. Peter the Great was, by almost any measure, the most transformative ruler in Russian history. When he came to power in 1682, sharing the throne initially with his sickly half-brother Ivan V, Russia was a medieval backwater. It was isolated from Western Europe, technologically primitive, militarily weak. Its army still fought with methods that would have been familiar to soldiers of the 15th century. Its economy was based on serfdom, with millions of peasants bound to the land like slaves. Its culture looked backward, toward Byzantium and the Orthodox Church, rather than forward toward the innovations emerging in the West. By the time Peter died in 1725, he had dragged his country kicking and screaming into the modern age. He built a navy from scratch, learning shipbuilding techniques himself by working incognito in Dutch and English shipyards. He defeated the Swedish Empire, then the dominant power in Northern Europe, in a war that lasted 21 years. He conquered territories along the Baltic Sea that gave Russia access to European trade routes. He founded a new capital city, St. Petersburg, carving it out of swamps at the eastern end of the Baltic, a window to Europe that would showcase Russia's new status. Peter reformed the army, creating a professional force equipped and trained along Western European lines. He reformed the government, replacing the old Boyar Council with a system of administrative colleges modeled on Swedish and German bureaucracies. He reformed the church, abolishing the Patriarchate and placing the Orthodox Church under a holy synod controlled by the state. He even reformed how Russians looked, ordering nobles to shave their beards and wear Western clothing instead of traditional Russian dress. Peter was, in many ways, the opposite of a religious zealot. He was interested in science, in technology, in practical results. He corresponded with the philosopher Leibniz. He founded the Russian Academy of Sciences. He collected curiosities and scientific instruments. He invited foreign experts to Russia by the thousands, Dutchmen and Germans and Englishmen, Protestants and Catholics, and even a few Jews, anyone who could help modernize his backward country. Religious orthodoxy mattered less to Peter than competence. He cared about what people could do, not what they believed. He had no patience for old superstitions or traditional ways of doing things simply because they were traditional. He was a pragmatist to his core. So what did Peter think about Jews? The evidence is complicated, and it reveals a ruler whose attitudes were far more nuanced than those of his daughter Elizabeth. On one hand, we have accounts of Peter's personal anti-Jewish prejudice. The most famous quote comes from the memoirs of Andrei Nartov, a mechanic and inventor who worked closely with Peter for years. According to Nartov, Peter once declared, "I prefer to see in our midst nations professing Mohammedanism and paganism rather than Jews. They are rogues and cheats. It is my endeavor to eradicate evil, not to multiply it." In 1721, Peter issued a decree ordering the expulsion of Jews from Little Russia, the Ukrainian territories that Russia had acquired. The decree commanded that Jews be removed immediately, and that none of them be admitted into Russia for any purpose under any disguise. On paper, this looks like straightforward anti-Semitism of the same variety that had characterized Russian policy for centuries. But here's where Peter's approach becomes interesting and important. His hostility was fundamentally different from what came later. Peter didn't care about Jewish blood or Jewish ancestry. What he cared about was Jewish religion. Judaism itself was the problem, in his view, not some inherent quality of Jewish people. And if a Jew converted to Orthodox Christianity, truly converted, and was baptized into the church, then Peter didn't just accept them. He promoted them to the highest offices in the empire. Consider the case of Baron Peter Pavlovich Shafirov. Shafirov's grandfather was a Polish Jew from Smolensk named Shafir. At some point, probably in the mid-17th century, Shafir converted to Russian Orthodoxy. His descendants rose rapidly in Russian society, their Jewish origins apparently no obstacle to advancement. And Peter Pavlovich Shafirov himself, the grandson of a Jew, became nothing less than the vice-chancellor of the Russian Empire. The vice-chancellor was the highest diplomatic office in the government, second only to the chancellor in the hierarchy of state service. Shafirov negotiated critical treaties for Russia. He helped shape Russian foreign policy during the most important period of expansion in the country's history. His most famous moment came during the Pruth campaign of 1711. Peter had led his army deep into Ottoman territory, pursuing a war against the Turks. But the campaign went badly. The Russian army found itself surrounded by vastly superior Ottoman forces. Peter himself faced the possibility of capture or death. It was Shafirov who negotiated the peace that saved the Tsar and his army. The terms were unfavorable to Russia, requiring the surrender of territory and the destruction of fortresses. But Peter and his soldiers were allowed to withdraw, and the war was ended without total catastrophe. As part of the deal, Shafirov himself was left behind as a hostage with the Turks, a position of enormous danger. He remained in Ottoman captivity for 3 years before being released. After his return, Shafirov continued to serve in high positions. He wrote a major treatise defending Russia's claims in the Great Northern War against Sweden. He helped shape Russian diplomacy for decades. He was one of the most powerful men in the empire, and his grandfather had been a Jew. Or consider Anton Manuel Devier. Devier was born in Holland, probably in the 1680s, to a Portuguese converso family. Conversos were Jews who had converted to Christianity, often under pressure from the Spanish or Portuguese Inquisitions. Some conversos assimilated completely into Christian society. Others maintained Jewish practices in secret, becoming crypto-Jews who publicly attended Mass while privately observing the Sabbath and Jewish holidays. Devier's family had fled Portugal for the relative tolerance of the Dutch Republic. His exact religious background is unclear, but his Jewish ancestry was known. He came to Russia in Peter's service, possibly as a cabin boy on one of the ships Peter purchased in Holland, and he rose through the ranks to become a trusted official. Peter appointed Devier as the first General Polizeimeister of St. Petersburg, the chief of police of the new capital city. He was responsible for maintaining order in the city Peter was building from nothing, for enforcing the new regulations Peter decreed, for making sure this showcase of Russian modernization actually functioned. He held one of the most powerful and sensitive positions in the imperial government. Devier eventually fell from favor, not because of his Jewish ancestry, but because of political intrigues. He was exiled to Siberia after Peter's death, restored to favor under Empress Elizabeth, ironically given her attitudes, and ended his days as a senator. His career illustrates both the possibilities and the dangers of life at the Russian court. But his Jewish background was never the central issue. Then there was John da Costa, sometimes called La Costa, Peter's court jester. Da Costa was of Portuguese Jewish origin and made no particular secret of it. He was nominally baptized in 1717, going through the formal ceremony of conversion to Russian Orthodoxy, but reportedly never actually practiced Christianity in any meaningful way. Peter apparently found the situation amusing rather than offensive. He enjoyed da Costa's wit and kept him at court for entertainment. There's even an apocryphal story, almost certainly invented but revealing in what it says about perceptions of Peter's court, that claims Peter, Shafirov, Devaye, and da Costa once conducted a Passover Seder together, with the Tsar himself wearing a skull cap. The story is almost certainly false, but the fact that people told it suggests that Peter's court was perceived as unusually tolerant of Jewish connections, at least for those who had nominally converted. Peter's approach to Jews, then, was what we might call pragmatic prejudice. He didn't like Judaism. He didn't want practicing Jews in his empire. He shared the general Russian fear that Jews might try to convert Christians, might spread their false religion, might corrupt the Orthodox faith. But he valued talent and competence above religious purity. If a Jew converted, truly converted, and became part of Russian Orthodox society, then Peter would judge them on their merits. Some of those converts rose to the highest positions in the land. Peter's Russia was not a tolerant society by modern standards, but it offered a path to acceptance that his daughter Elizabeth would close off entirely. This matters because it establishes a crucial contrast with what came later. Elizabeth inherited none of her father's pragmatism. For her, the line between Christian and Jew was absolute and unbridgeable. She rejected not only practicing Jews, but also those of Jewish ancestry, even those whose families had been Christian for generations. The stain of Jewish blood in her eyes could never be fully washed away. But before we get to Elizabeth, one more story from Peter's reign deserves attention, because it shows that even under this relatively tolerant ruler, Jews in Russia lived under constant threat, dependent on the protection of a sovereign who might not always be there to protect them. In August 1708, during the Great Northern War, Peter's armies were marching through the borderlands of what is now Belarus. They came to the town of Mstislavl, a community with a substantial Jewish population. There, some of Peter's soldiers decided to attack the local Jews. Perhaps they were drunk. Perhaps they had been influenced by the traditional anti-Semitism of Russian popular culture. Perhaps they saw an opportunity for looting and rape. Whatever their reasons, they were preparing to assault the Jewish quarter. When Peter heard about the impending pogrom, he did something unexpected. He personally went to the synagogue and stood before it, confronting his own soldiers. The Tsar of all Russia, supreme commander of the armed forces, planted himself between the mob and its intended victims. He prevented the attack. The soldiers backed down, unwilling to challenge their sovereign directly. And afterward, Peter ordered 13 of the ringleaders executed as an example to others. This incident tells us something important about Peter. He was capable of protecting Jews when he chose to. He understood that mob violence was bad for order and discipline. He wasn't driven by the visceral hatred that characterized many of his predecessors and successors. When confronted with a choice between tolerating a pogrom and intervening to stop it, he intervened. But Peter's intervention also reveals the fragility of Jewish safety in Russia. The Jews of Mstislav were saved not by any legal right, not by any guaranteed protection, but by the personal decision of an autocrat who happened to be present and happened to feel like protecting them. If Peter had been elsewhere, if he had been in a different mood, if he hadn't cared, the outcome would have been very different. Peter died in 1725, and the question of who would succeed him plunged Russia into decades of instability. What he had changed the succession laws to allow rulers to name their own heirs. But then he died suddenly without naming anyone. The throne passed through a bewildering series of hands. Peter's widow Catherine I, who ruled briefly until her death in 1727. Peter's young grandson, Peter II, who died of smallpox in 1730 at just 14. Anna Ivanovna, a niece of Peter's from a different branch of the family, who ruled until 1740. The infant Ivan VI, whose regency lasted barely a year before the coup that brought Elizabeth to power. During this chaos, Russian policy toward Jews became harsher. Each ruler tried to establish their legitimacy by demonstrating their Orthodox credentials, and persecuting Jews was an easy way to do that. Anna Ivanovna issued decrees restricting Jewish residence and trade, while tightening the exclusion that Peter had maintained somewhat loosely. And during Anna's reign, an event occurred that would cast a long shadow over everything that followed, an event that seemed to confirm every Russian fear about Jews, every suspicion that they were actively trying to undermine Christianity, every belief that they were dangerous enemies who needed to be eliminated. It was a trial, and it ended with 2 men burned alive in the public square of St. Petersburg. In the 1730s, a Jewish merchant from Smolensk named Boruch Lebov made a friend. Smolensk was a border city, changing hands between Russia and Poland-Lithuania multiple times over the centuries. It had a small Jewish population, and Boruch Lebov was one of them. He was a merchant, trading goods across the border, navigating the complex world of commerce in the Russian Empire. His friend was a Russian naval officer named Alexander Voznitsin, a captain lieutenant. How they met, why they became close, the historical sources don't tell us. Perhaps Voznitsin purchased goods from Lebov. Perhaps they were introduced through mutual acquaintances. Perhaps they simply struck up a conversation somewhere and found they enjoyed each other's company. But at some point their friendship crossed a line that Russian law considered the most serious crime imaginable. Boruch Lebov convinced Alexander Voznitsin to convert to Judaism. This wasn't a casual theological discussion or an abstract exchange of ideas. Voznitsin actually converted. He traveled to Poland, outside Russian jurisdiction, where he was circumcised according to Jewish law. He returned to Russia as, well, in his own understanding and in the understanding of Jewish law, a Jew. He began observing Jewish practices, keeping the Sabbath, following Jewish dietary laws, praying in the Jewish manner. For a Russian Orthodox Christian to abandon Christianity for Judaism was, under Russian law, one of the worst crimes imaginable. It was apostasy, blasphemy, and treason all rolled into one. The law code of 1649, the Sobornoi Ulogenie, prescribed death by burning for anyone who blasphemed against God, the Virgin Mary, or the saints. And leading a Christian to abandon the faith was considered blasphemy of the most severe kind. This might have remained secret forever. Voznitsin was living on an estate in the Russian countryside, away from the scrutiny of authorities. He could have practiced his new faith quietly, and no one might ever have known. But in 1737, his wife denounced him. We don't know why she did it. Perhaps she was genuinely horrified by her husband's apostasy. Perhaps their marriage had soured and she saw a way to be rid of him. Perhaps she feared that his crime would eventually be discovered, and that she would be punished as a co-conspirator if she hadn't reported it. Whatever her reasons, she went to the authorities. She told them that her husband had stopped wearing a cross. He prayed facing the wall instead of toward the icons, as Orthodox Christians did. He had ordered peasants on his estate to destroy their icons. He observed the Jewish Sabbath, refusing to work from Friday evening to Saturday evening. He refused to eat pork or other foods forbidden by Jewish law. Voznitsin was arrested. Under interrogation, which almost certainly included torture, he admitted everything, and he named Boruch Leibov as the man who had led him to Judaism. Both men were brought before the Office of Secret Investigations, the Tainaya Kancellaria, the dreaded secret police of the Russian state. They were questioned extensively. The investigation dragged on for months as officials tried to determine if there were others involved, if this was part of a larger conspiracy, if other Christians had been converted. Their fate was sealed by the law of 1649. On July 15, 1738, Boruch Leibov and Alexander Voznitsin were taken to the main square of St. Petersburg. There, in the capital city that Peter the Great had built as a symbol of Russia's modern European future, they were burned alive at the stake. Some scholars have called this event the last auto da fe in Europe. Auto da fe, Portuguese for act of faith, was the term used by the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions for the public ritual in which condemned heretics were handed over to secular authorities for execution, usually by burning. By 1738, such executions had become rare even in Spain and Portugal, where the Inquisition was winding down. The Enlightenment was spreading across Europe. The execution of heretics seemed like a relic of a darker age. But in Russia, in the middle of the supposed Age of Reason, 2 men were still being burned alive for the crime of religious conversion. The execution of Leibov and Voznitsin sent shockwaves through Russian policy toward Jews. Here was proof, or what looked like proof, that the ancient fear of the Judaizers had been justified all along. Jews really were trying to convert Christians. The threat was not hypothetical or historical, but present and active. A Jew had actually succeeded in leading a Russian naval officer to abandon Christ. Empress Anna Ivanovna, who was ruling at the time, responded with a new decree in 1739, ordering the expulsion of Jews from Little Russia, the Ukrainian territories under Russian control. The decree explicitly cited the Leibov case as justification. Jews were dangerous. They were missionaries of a hostile faith. They could not be trusted to live among Christians. But Anna died in October 1740, and the political chaos that followed delayed the full implementation of her decree. The infant Ivan VI was proclaimed emperor, with Anna Leopoldovna serving as regent. The government was consumed by internal intrigues. The expulsion of Jews was not a priority. And then, in November 1741, a new ruler came to power, a ruler who had watched these events unfold during her years of waiting for the throne, a ruler who had her own reasons for religious zeal, her own need to prove her orthodox credentials, her own convictions about the enemies of Christ. Her name was Elizabeth Petrovna. She was the daughter of Peter the Great, and she would make the expulsion of Jews from Russia not a temporary measure, not an emergency response to a single incident, but a matter of deep personal conviction that she would maintain for the rest of her life. On the night of November 24th, 1741, according to the old Russian calendar, Elizabeth made her move. She was 32 years old. She had spent her entire adult life waiting, watching, surviving. She was the daughter of Peter the Great and Catherine I, born on December 18, 1709, in the village of Kolomenskoye near Moscow. Her birth came just months after her father's greatest military victory, the Battle of Poltava, which had broken Swedish power and established Russia as a major European force. But Elizabeth had been born before her parents were married. Peter and Catherine didn't formalize their union until 1712, 3 years after Elizabeth's birth. This made her technically illegitimate, a fact that would hang over her entire life. In the world of European royalty, where bloodlines and legitimacy mattered intensely, Elizabeth's status was always questionable. She had been raised in the glittering court her father created. She learned French, the language of European diplomacy and fashion. She studied music and dancing, becoming famous for her grace on the dance floor. She was considered one of the most beautiful women in Europe, and Peter entertained hopes of marrying her to a European prince, perhaps even to the young Louis XV of France. But those plans came to nothing. Peter died suddenly in 1725, without naming an heir. Elizabeth's mother Catherine took the throne but died just 2 years later. The crown passed to Peter's grandson, Peter II, a teenager who showed little interest in Elizabeth. Then Peter II died of smallpox in 1730, and the throne went to Anna Ivanovna, a cousin from a different branch of the family. Under Anna's reign, Elizabeth lived in a kind of gilded exile. She was too prominent to ignore, the daughter of the great Peter, but too dangerous to trust. Anna's government kept her under surveillance, limited her income, surrounded her with spies. There were rumors that Anna considered sending Elizabeth to a convent, removing her from the succession entirely. Elizabeth survived by appearing harmless. She cultivated a reputation for frivolity, for caring only about dresses and parties and love affairs. She stayed away from politics, or seemed to. She demonstrated her piety, attending church regularly, making pilgrimages to monasteries, showing herself to be a devout daughter of the Orthodox Church. But she was also watching, waiting, building connections with the Guards regiments, the elite military units that had the power to make and unmake rulers. When the moment came, she was ready. Anna Ivanovna died in October 1740. Her heir was her grandnephew Ivan VI, an infant just 2 months old. The regent was Anna Leopoldovna, a German-born niece of the late empress. The government was dominated by German advisors, Count Munich, the military commander, Count Osterman, the foreign policy expert. Russian nobles resented these foreigners. The Guards regiments seethed with discontent. Elizabeth saw her chance. On that November night, she went to the barracks of the Preobrazhensky Life Guards Regiment. This was one of the elite units her father had founded, men who remembered Peter the Great and who might be willing to support his daughter. She dressed carefully for the occasion, wearing a soldier's metal breastplate over her dress. In her hand, she carried a large silver cross. She addressed the soldiers directly. Her words have been reported in various forms by different sources, but the essence was clear. "Whom do you want to serve?" she asked them. "Me, your natural sovereign, or those who have stolen my inheritance?" The soldiers chose her. About 300 of them marched with her through the snow-covered streets of St. Petersburg. It was the middle of the night, freezing cold, the city mostly asleep. They encountered no resistance. The conspiracy had been well planned, and any potential opposition had been neutralized. They reached the Winter Palace. Elizabeth herself led the way into the regent's chambers. She woke Anna Leopoldovna with the words, "Time to get up, sister." No blood was shed. The infant Ivan VI was taken into custody, beginning a lifetime of imprisonment that would end only with his murder during Catherine the Great's reign. Anna Leopoldovna and her family were arrested and eventually exiled. The German advisors were seized. Osterman would be sentenced to death, commuted to exile, while Munich sent to Siberia. By morning, Elizabeth Petrovna was Empress of all Russia. The religious symbolism of the coup was not accidental. Elizabeth's proclamations framed her seizure of power as a liberation of the Russian people from foreign influence, from enemies of the Christian faith. "The Russian people have been groaning under the enemies of the Christian faith," one proclamation declared. "But she has delivered them from the degrading foreign oppression." Who were these enemies of the Christian faith? The proclamation meant primarily the German Lutheran advisors who had dominated the previous regime. But the language was broader than that. It positioned Elizabeth as a defender of Russian Orthodoxy against all its enemies, foreign and domestic, Lutheran and Jewish, why anyone who threatened the religious purity of the Russian state. Elizabeth's personal piety was genuine, intense, and somewhat contradictory. She never missed Sunday Mass. She undertook regular pilgrimages to monasteries, walking sometimes for miles, fasting strictly along the way. She founded convents and endowed churches. She sought the advice of clergy and showed deep respect for the Orthodox hierarchy. At the same time, she was famous for her extravagance. She reportedly owned more than 15,000 dresses and changed her outfits up to 6 times a day. She threw lavish balls and masquerades, sometimes requiring all guests to come dressed as the opposite sex, so she could show off her legs in men's breeches. She ate and drank to excess. She took lovers freely, including Alexei Razumovsky, a Ukrainian Cossack singer who may have been her secret morganatic husband. But these contradictions existed within a framework of deep, sincere religious conviction. Elizabeth believed that she was God's chosen instrument for Russia. She believed that Russia's greatness depended on its religious purity. She believed that enemies of the faith, whoever they might be, had to be eliminated or expelled. When she seized power, she made a vow. She promised God that if she became empress, she would never sign a death sentence. And she kept that promise, at least technically, throughout her 20-year reign. Capital punishment in Russia effectively ceased during Elizabeth's rule. Criminals, who would have been executed under previous rulers, were instead exiled to Siberia, beaten with the knout until they were half dead. Why had their nostrils slit with hot irons, but they were not formally killed. This vow of mercy would coexist, without apparent contradiction in Elizabeth's mind, with her policy toward the Jews. She wouldn't kill them, but she would drive them from their homes. During her reign, Elizabeth pursued religious homogeneity with unprecedented vigor. More than 430,000 people were converted to Russian Orthodoxy across the empire's eastern territories in missionary campaigns that combined persuasion with pressure. In the Kazan region, she ordered the destruction of 418 out of 536 mosques. Non-Orthodox Christians faced new restrictions on their activities and movements, and the Jews were about to discover what it meant to be ruled by someone who saw religious purity not as one priority among many, but as her personal mission from God. And in the early months of 1742, as Elizabeth consolidated her power and prepared for her coronation, the question of the Jews came before her government. There were not many Jews in Russia proper. The exclusionary policies of earlier rulers had seen to that. Peter's pragmatic tolerance had allowed some Jewish presence, but his successors had tightened restrictions. The Lebov-Voznitsin case had terrified Russian officialdom and led to Anna's expulsion decree for Little Russia. But the expulsion under Anna had never been fully implemented. In the border regions of Little Russia and White Russia, the Ukrainian and Belarusian territories, Jewish communities still existed. Jewish merchants crossed the borders to trade at Russian fairs. Some had been living in Russian territory for years, their status ambiguous. Their presence tolerated in practice, even if not sanctioned by law. Elizabeth decided to end that ambiguity. On December 2, 1742, she signed a decree ordering the expulsion of all Jews from the Russian Empire. The language was comprehensive and absolute. Jews were to leave from both Great Russian and Little Russian cities, villages, and hamlets with their property. The decree covered all Russian territory without exception. Great Russia around Moscow in the north, Little Russia in Ukraine, White Russia in Belarus, Riga, and the Baltic provinces. All conquered cities. No Jews were to remain. There was only one exception written into the decree. Jews who converted to Russian Orthodoxy could stay. They would be required to submit to baptism, to renounce their ancestral faith, to become Orthodox Christians in every respect. If they did so, they could remain in Russia. But even this exception came with a condition that revealed the depth of Elizabeth's suspicion. Converts were forbidden from ever leaving Russia again. Once you converted, you were trapped. You could never return to Jewish communities abroad, never reconnect with relatives who hadn't converted, never have the option of reverting to your former faith. The conversion had to be total and irrevocable. The decree was recorded in the Polnoy Sobrany Zakonov, the complete collection of laws of the Russian Empire, as Decree number 8673 in Volume 11. It became the legal foundation for Russian policy toward Jews for the next 2 decades of Elizabeth's reign. What makes Elizabeth's decree particularly striking is that it wasn't driven by any immediate crisis. The Lebov-Voznitsin case had occurred 4 years earlier, under the previous regime. No new incidents had come to light. No Jew had been accused of converting anyone. No controversy was raging in the provinces about Jewish activities. The decree was purely ideological. Elizabeth expelled the Jews, not because of anything they had done recently, but because of what she believed they were. They were, in her understanding, enemies of Christ. Their very presence was a contamination of Christian lands. Tolerating them, even for commercial purposes, was an offense against God. This interpretation is confirmed by what happened next, when practical reality collided with Elizabeth's theological convictions. The expulsion, once ordered, proved difficult to implement. Many Jews had been living in the border regions for years, or even generations. They had businesses, property, relationships with local merchants and officials. They were integrated into the economic life of their communities. The local authorities weren't necessarily eager to uproot them, whatever the decree from distant St. Petersburg might say. By 1743, the Senate reported that only 142 Jews, counting men, women, and children together, had actually been expelled from Russian territory. That was a tiny fraction of the Jewish population in the affected areas, perhaps only 1 or 2% of those who should have been removed under the terms of the decree. At the same time, complaints started arriving at the capital from various quarters. Merchants wrote to say that Jewish traders came to Russian fairs only temporarily, staying for the duration of the fair and then leaving. They paid duties to the treasury on their imports and exports. They brought goods that Russian consumers wanted and couldn't easily get elsewhere. Expelling them didn't protect anyone. It just disrupted commerce. Other petitions pointed out that some Jewish merchants had arrived in Russia with their goods before they even learned about the decree. They had invested their capital, transported their merchandise, made commitments to buyers. Now they were being told to leave immediately, taking losses that would ruin them. The authorities in Riga, the major Baltic port that was crucial to Russian trade with Western Europe, reported serious trade confusion. Business relationships that had developed over years were being torn apart. Deals were falling through. Credit arrangements were collapsing. The orderly functioning of commerce was breaking down. Most significantly, the business relationships between Jewish merchants and Greek Orthodox merchants proved to be so intertwined that expelling the Jews was, in the Senate's words, causing ruin to the Greeks as well. The Greek merchants who traded with Russia, many of them Orthodox Christians in good standing, depended on their Jewish business partners. Eliminating the Jews meant eliminating the Greeks' livelihoods too. The little Russian Cossacks, the Ukrainian population that was supposed to be protected from Jewish influence, sent their own petitions asking for the Jews to return. Whatever resentments had fueled the Khmelnitzky uprising a century earlier, the Cossacks of the 1740s had apparently learned to coexist with their Jewish neighbors and didn't appreciate having them expelled. The Senate, receiving all these complaints, did what bureaucrats often do when faced with a policy that isn't working. They drafted a report for the Empress, laying out the situation honestly and suggesting a modification. The Senate's report didn't challenge Elizabeth's religious convictions. The senators were too smart for that. They didn't argue that Jews were harmless or that their presence was beneficial to Russian souls. They simply laid out the economic facts. The expulsion was causing financial damage. Trade was being disrupted. Tax revenues were declining. The treasury was losing money. Surely, the Senate suggested carefully, the Empress could allow Jews to return for commercial purposes. Not to settle permanently, of course, not to become residents of Russian cities, but just temporarily for the duration of the great fairs where so much business was conducted. Surely the economic interests of the empire could be accommodated without compromising the Empress's religious principles. Elizabeth's response has become one of the most quoted lines in the entire history of Russian anti-Semitism. It expressed her worldview with perfect clarity, and it shut down any further debate. On the margin of the Senate's report, in her own handwriting, she wrote 6 words in Russian. «Я не хочу никакой выгоды или прибыли от врагов Христовых. translated into English. I do not wish any profit from the enemies of Christ. The sentence has been rendered in various ways by different translators. I want no benefit from the enemies of Christ. From the enemies of Christ I desire neither gain nor profit. The precise wording varies, but the meaning is unmistakable. Elizabeth was not willing to trade religious principle for economic advantage. The Jews were enemies of Christ, and enemies of Christ had no place in Russia, regardless of how much money their presence might bring to the treasury. On January 25, 1744, the Senate formally capitulated. They issued a new decree confirming and expanding the expulsion. Jews were to be removed from Little Russia, White Russia, and all conquered cities. They were banned from Russia entirely, even for commercial purposes, even temporarily, even under supervision. The door that had been slightly ajar was now slammed shut, and the Senate was instructed, in language that brooked no argument, on not to make any further representations on the subject. The decision was final. The Empress had spoken. There would be no more petitions, no more reports about economic damage, no more suggestions that perhaps a compromise might be possible. The message was clear to everyone who received it. Elizabeth's opposition to Jewish presence in Russia was not a negotiable policy position. It was not subject to modification based on practical considerations. It was an article of faith, and faith, for Elizabeth, was not something that could be traded away for profit. Once Elizabeth made her position clear, the expulsion gathered momentum. The historian Salo Baron, one of the greatest Jewish historians of the 20th century, estimated that approximately 35,000 Jews were expelled from Russian territory between 1742 and 1753. This figure has been accepted by most subsequent scholars, though some suggest the number might have been somewhat higher or lower depending on how strictly the decree was enforced in different regions. 35,000 people, men, women, children, elderly, infants, merchants and craftsmen, scholars and laborers, the wealthy and the desperately poor, all of them forced to leave their homes, their businesses, their communities, simply because of who they were and what they believed. Where did they go? Most returned to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the great Jewish homeland that stretched along Russia's western border. Despite the catastrophe of the Khmelnitzky uprising, Poland-Lithuania still had the largest Jewish population in the world. It still had the legal framework, the Statute of Kalas, and its successors. That protected Jewish residents and commerce. It still had the Jewish communal institutions, the Kehillat, and the remnants of the Council of Four Lands that could absorb newcomers. It still had the economic niches, the tavern keeping, and the estate management, and the long-distance trade that Jews had filled for centuries. The expelled Jews joined their co-religionists across the border. They rebuilt their lives as best they could, finding new homes in Polish cities and towns, re-establishing businesses, reconnecting with family members they had left behind. They joined communities that were themselves still recovering from the violence of the previous century, and they waited. They waited for the policy to change, for a new ruler to take the throne, for some shift in the circumstance that might allow them to return. Why, some of them would wait for decades. Some would never return at all. The expulsion, meanwhile, was enforced with increasing strictness as time went on. Russian authorities at the borders searched Jews leaving the country to make sure they weren't carrying gold ducats or Russian coins. Any precious metals or currency they found were confiscated and exchanged for copper, which was worth far less. The departing Jews were to be stripped of their portable wealth as well as their homes. Those who tried to evade the expulsion, who hid, or who bribed local officials to look the other way, faced severe punishments if caught. The decree was not just a statement of policy, but an active enforcement effort, with officials throughout the border regions tasked with finding and removing any Jews who remained. Some Jews tried to convert to avoid expulsion. The records are incomplete, but we know that some conversions occurred. Individuals or families who decided that remaining in Russia was worth the price of abandoning their ancestral faith. What happened to those converts afterward is harder to trace. The decree had specified that they could never leave Russia, but whether they were actually integrated into Russian society or remained marginalized outsiders is unclear. Elizabeth's zealotry extended even to people she had trusted personally, people who had served her well, people whose contributions to Russian society should have earned them some consideration. Around 1747, Elizabeth made a disturbing discovery about one of the members of her own court. Her court physician, Dr. Antonio Ribeiro Sanchez, was of Jewish origin. Sanchez was a fascinating figure in his own right. He was born in Portugal around 1699 to a converso family, descendants of Jews who had converted to Christianity during the era of the Inquisition. Like many conversos, his family had maintained some connection to Jewish identity even while outwardly practicing Catholicism. He had trained as a physician in Portugal, Spain, and Italy before being recruited to Russia in the 1730s. Sanchez served in the Russian imperial medical establishment for over a decade. He was a skilled physician, well regarded by his colleagues and patients. In 1744, when the future Catherine the Great was dangerously ill, it was Sanchez who treated her. His care may well have saved her life, preserving the woman who would one day become one of Russia's greatest rulers. But none of that mattered to Elizabeth. When she learned, or probably through informants or investigations into backgrounds, that Sanchez had Jewish ancestry, she summarily dismissed him from her service. No trial, no investigation, no opportunity to explain or defend himself, no consideration of his years of loyal service, or his medical skills or the life he had saved. He was of Jewish blood, and that was enough. Sanchez left Russia and eventually settled in Paris, where he continued his medical career with considerable success. He became a corresponding member of the French Academy of Sciences and wrote influential works on public health. He lived until 1783, long enough to see the American Revolution and the early stirrings of the French Revolution. His dismissal from Russian service proved to be, for him personally, a blessing in disguise. But his case illustrated something important about Elizabeth's anti-Semitism. This wasn't just about religion, not entirely. Peter the Great had welcomed converted Jews into the highest offices. Elizabeth rejected even those who had been Christians for generations, whose Jewish ancestors had converted a century or more in the past. The stain of Jewish ancestry, in Elizabeth's eyes, could never be fully washed away. Conversion was not enough. Christian baptism was not enough. Years of faithful service were not enough. Once a Jew, always a Jew, in some essential way that couldn't be erased by any ceremony or any passage of time. The mathematician Leonhard Euler, one of the greatest scientists of the 18th century, was then living in Berlin. He heard about what was happening in Russia, about the dismissal of Sanchez and the broader persecution of anyone with Jewish connections, and he remarked in a letter, "I doubt much whether such strange procedures can add to the glory of the Academy of Sciences." It was a gentle criticism, phrased diplomatically, but the meaning was clear. Russia was making itself ridiculous in the eyes of educated Europe. The Enlightenment was spreading across the continent. Philosophers were questioning traditional prejudices. Scientists were demanding evidence and reason. And Russia was still expelling people based on the religious practices of their great-grandparents. But Elizabeth didn't care about the opinions of European intellectuals. She didn't care about the Academy of Sciences or what foreign mathematicians thought. She cared about religious purity. She cared about protecting Russia from the enemies of Christ, and for 20 years, until her death in 1761, she maintained her policy without wavering. The expulsion remained in effect throughout Elizabeth's reign. Jews were excluded from Russia not just as a practical matter but as a point of principle, a demonstration of the Empress's religious commitment, a policy that could not be compromised for any consideration of economics or diplomacy or enlightened opinion. Elizabeth Petrovna died on December 25, 1761, according to the old Russian calendar. It was Christmas Day, an appropriate date for a ruler who had defined herself as a defender of Christianity. She was 52 years old. She had never married publicly, though she may have been secretly wed to Alexei Razumovsky. She had no legitimate children. The throne passed to her nephew, Peter III, the grandson of Peter the Great through his daughter Anna. Peter III was a strange choice for the Russian throne. He was more German than Russian, more Lutheran than Orthodox, and he openly admired Frederick the Great of Prussia, the very enemy Russia had been fighting in the 7 Years' War. Peter III's reign lasted only 186 days. In July 1762, his wife, a German princess who had taken the Russian name Catherine, overthrew him with the help of the Guards regiments, the same method Elizabeth had used 20 years before. A week later, Peter was dead, probably murdered, though Catherine always claimed he died of natural causes. Catherine II, who would become known as Catherine the Great, was now Empress of Russia. And with her reign, everything would begin to change. Catherine was different from Elizabeth in almost every way. She was German-born, raised as a Lutheran, converted to Orthodoxy only for her marriage to Peter III. She was educated in the ideas of the Enlightenment, an avid reader who corresponded with Voltaire and Diderot, and considered herself a philosopher on the throne. She was pragmatic, flexible, and utterly unsentimental about religion. Catherine's approach to the Jews reflected these differences. But it also reflected the constraints of Russian politics, the limits of what even an enlightened despot could achieve in a society steeped in centuries of prejudice. In 1763, Catherine issued a manifesto establishing the Chancellery for the guardianship of foreigners. Russia was vast and underpopulated. Foreign settlers with useful skills were actively sought. Germans, in particular, were invited to colonize the empty lands along the Volga River and in other frontier regions. But the manifesto explicitly excluded Jews. Whatever Catherine's personal feelings might have been, she understood that openly welcoming Jews would be politically dangerous. The Orthodox Church remained powerful and hostile to any hint of tolerance. Elizabeth's policies remained popular among the nobility and the bureaucracy. Catherine herself was a foreigner, a usurper who had just murdered her husband. She couldn't afford to appear soft on the enemies of Christ. What she could do was make quiet exceptions, using the autocratic power that no one could openly challenge. In May 1764, Catherine wrote an official letter to George Brown, the Governor-General of Riga. The letter dealt with various administrative matters, the kind of routine correspondence that passes between rulers and their subordinates. But at the bottom, written in German rather than Russian, Catherine added a secret postscript. The postscript named 8 specific Jews: merchants David Levy, Moses Aaron, Israel Lazar, a worker named Jacob Marcus, Rabbi Israel Hayim and his assistant Natan Abram, and a Mohel, a ritual circumciser named Lazar Israel. These individuals were to be quietly admitted to Riga and allowed to conduct their business without interference. Catherine's postscript concluded with a warning in German: Halten Sie dieses alles geheim. Keep all this a secret. This was how Catherine operated. Publicly, the ban on Jewish residence remained in place. Officially, Elizabeth's decree was still the law of the land. But quietly, through private letters and secret orders, Catherine created exceptions. Jews who were useful, Jews who had the right connections, Jews who could contribute to the economy without attracting too much attention were allowed in through the back door. By 1769, Catherine had authorized Jewish settlement in the newly acquired southern territories of Novorossiya, the new Russia along the Black Sea coast. These were frontier lands, recently conquered from the Ottoman Empire, sparsely populated and in need of settlers. Jews who moved there wouldn't be living in the Russian heartland, wouldn't be visible in Moscow or St. Petersburg, wouldn't offend the sensibilities of traditional Orthodox society. This was Catherine's compromise: official exclusion combined with unofficial tolerance, public piety combined with private pragmatism. It was a holding pattern, as a way of managing an impossible situation. And then, in 1772, the situation became truly impossible, not because of anything Catherine did, but because of something that happened to Poland. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, That vast state that had been home to 3/4 of the world's Jews was dying. Poland's political system had become dysfunctional. The liberum veto, which allowed any single noble to block any legislation, made effective government impossible. The great nobles had become so powerful that the king was little more than a figurehead. Neighboring powers, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, had been interfering in Polish affairs for decades, supporting rival factions, stirring up conflicts, weakening the state from within. In 1772, those three powers decided to help themselves to Polish territory. This was the first partition of Poland, and it marked the beginning of the end for the Commonwealth. Russia took a huge swath of what is now Belarus and eastern Latvia, territories that Poland-Lithuania called White Russia and Polish Livonia. Prussia took parts of the Baltic coast and the corridor between Brandenburg and East Prussia. Austria took the southern region called Galicia, and with the territories Russia annexed came people, Poles and Lithuanians, Ukrainians and Belarusians, and Jews, lots and lots of Jews. By some estimates, 600,000 Jews suddenly became subjects of the Russian Empire through the First Partition. More than Elizabeth had expelled in her entire reign, more than had ever lived in Russia before. A Jewish population larger than that of most European countries, acquired overnight through conquest. Russia hadn't sought them. Russia had spent centuries trying to keep them out. But now, through the accidents of geography and the logic of great power politics, Russia suddenly had one of the largest Jewish populations in Europe, and there would be more partitions. In 1793, the Second Partition gave Russia even more territory, including most of what is now western Ukraine. Another 400,000 Jews came with it. In 1795, the Third Partition finished off the Commonwealth entirely, erasing Poland from the map of Europe. Russia got Lithuania and the remaining Polish territories, along with another 250,000 Jews. By the end of the 18th century, Russia had the largest Jewish population in the world. Not because Russia had opened its doors, not because Enlightenment had triumphed over prejudice, but because Russia had swallowed the country that had opened its doors 3 centuries earlier. The question was no longer how to keep Jews out. That battle was lost. The question now was how to manage the Jews who were already within the empire's borders. Catherine's initial response was surprisingly moderate, at least on paper. She guaranteed the Jews of the newly acquired territories that they could keep the rights they had enjoyed under Poland. Jewish communities residing in the cities and territories now incorporated in the Russian Empire, she declared, shall be left in the enjoyment of all those liberties with regard to their religion and property which they at present possess. This sounded generous, but it was also pragmatic. Catherine couldn't simply expel 600,000 people. She couldn't force them all to convert. She needed the former Polish territories to function economically, and that meant allowing the Jews, who ran so much of the local economy, to continue their activities. The promise of continued rights was a way of maintaining order in newly conquered lands. But Catherine's tolerance had limits, and those limits would soon become a cage. In 1790, the Jewish merchants who had been doing business in Moscow received an unpleasant surprise. Their competitors, the Christian merchants of Moscow, had filed a formal complaint against them. The Christian merchants claimed that Jewish traders were undercutting them, stealing their business, violating the traditional rules of commerce. They accused the Jews of engaging in unfair practices, of using their networks and connections to gain advantages that honest Russian merchants couldn't match. They demanded that Jews be expelled from Moscow and restricted to the border territories where they had always lived. Catherine faced a dilemma that had no good solution. On one hand, she had promised the Jews of the former Polish territories that they could keep their existing rights. Breaking that promise would undermine trust and potentially cause unrest in newly acquired lands. On the other hand, she couldn't ignore the complaints of influential Russian merchants, Orthodox Christians who had political weight and whose grievances resonated with traditional Russian prejudices. Her solution became the foundation of Russian Jewish policy for the next 125 years. On December 23, 1791, Catherine issued a decree that would shape the lives of millions. Jews were forbidden from registering as merchants in interior Russian cities. They could only register, and therefore only legally reside and do business, in certain designated territories. This was the birth of the Pale of Settlement. The Pale, from the Latin word palus, meaning stake or boundary, was a geographic zone beyond which Jews could not legally live. Initially, it covered the Belarusian provinces of Vitebsk and Mogilev, plus the newly acquired southern territories along the Black Sea. Over time, as Russia absorbed more Polish territory through the later partitions, the Pale expanded to include most of what is now Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova. At its fullest extent, the Pale of Settlement covered approximately 500,000 square miles, about 20% of European Russia. It stretched from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south, from the borders of Prussia and Austria in the west to the boundaries of the Russian heartland in the east. Within this vast territory, Jews could live, work, and practice their religion. Outside it, they were forbidden. The Pale was not originally intended as a prison or a ghetto. In the context of late 18th century Russia, restricting populations to certain territories was not unusual. Serfs were bound to the land, unable to move without their lord's permission. Townspeople were registered in specific cities and couldn't relocate freely. Merchants could only trade within certain areas. Catherine's decree restricted Jews in ways that paralleled restrictions on other groups. Moreover, the early Pale actually expanded Jewish settlement options in some ways. Jews could now legally move to the new southern territories that had previously been completely off-limits. Cities like Odessa, founded in 1794, would become major centers of Jewish life precisely because they were within the Pale, but had not previously had large Jewish populations. But over time, the Pale became something different, something worse. Under Nicholas I, who ruled from 1825 to 1855, the restrictions tightened dramatically. Jews were expelled from villages within the Pale and concentrated in towns and cities. New areas were carved out of the Pale, places where Jews could no longer live even within the officially designated zone. The army began conscripting Jewish boys as young as 12, sending them to distant postings where they would be pressured to convert. Then came 1881 and the assassination of Tsar Alexander II. Anti-Jewish violence exploded across the Pale in a wave of pogroms, organized massacres that left hundreds dead and thousands homeless. The government, rather than protecting the victims, blamed them. The May laws of 1882 imposed new restrictions, forbidding Jews from settling in rural areas even within the Pale, limiting their access to education, constraining their economic activities. More pogroms followed in 1903 to 1906, including the infamous Kishinev pogrom of 1903, which shocked the world with its brutality. The violence, the restrictions, the poverty, the hopelessness combined to create an overwhelming pressure to leave. Between 1880 and 1920, approximately 2 million Jews left the Russian Empire, most of them heading for the United States. They settled in New York and Chicago, Philadelphia and Boston, on transforming the Jewish communities of America and changing the character of American cities. The Lower East Side of Manhattan, with its tenements and sweatshops, its Yiddish theaters and Jewish newspapers, its labor movements and literary societies, was built by refugees from the Pale of Settlement. Other Jews went elsewhere, to Palestine, where they founded the kibbutzim and cities that would become the State of Israel, to Argentina and Brazil, South Africa, and Australia, to Western Europe, where they often faced new forms of discrimination. The Jewish diaspora spread across the globe, driven by conditions in the Pale that had become intolerable. By the time of the Russian census of 1897, more than 5 million Jews lived within the Pale of Settlement. That was roughly 40% of all the Jews in the world, concentrated in a strip of territory on the western edge of the Russian Empire. They lived in shtetls, the small market towns that became the iconic setting of Eastern European Jewish life. They developed a vibrant culture, producing literature in Yiddish and Hebrew, religious movements like Hasidism, and secular movements like the Bund and Zionism. This was the world of Sholem Aleichem's Tevye the Dairyman, later adapted as Fiddler on the Roof, the world of the yeshivas and the rebbes, the matchmakers and the melamed, the merchants and the beggars, a world of poverty and prayer, of scholarship and struggle, of tight-knit communities bound together by faith and tradition, and the shared experience of persecution. The Pale of Settlement was finally abolished on March 20, 1917. On just weeks after the February Revolution overthrew the Romanov dynasty. By then, millions had already left, and within a generation, the world of the shtetl would be destroyed entirely, not by immigration, but by murder, as the Holocaust swept away the civilization that had existed for centuries. We began this story with a woman sitting alone in the Winter Palace, signing a decree that would uproot tens of thousands of people. Now we can see what that decree set in motion. Elizabeth's expulsion of 1742 was not the only Jewish expulsion in European history. England had expelled its Jews in 1290. France had done so in 1394. Spain's expulsion of 1492 remains the most famous of all, the event that scattered Sephardic Jews across the Mediterranean world and beyond. But Russia's case was different in a crucial way. Those other expulsions removed Jewish communities that had lived in those countries for centuries. They were expulsions of established populations, people whose families had been French or English or Spanish for generations. Russia, by contrast, had never really admitted Jews in the first place. Elizabeth's decree was the culmination of a policy of perpetual exclusion, the final slamming of a door that had never truly been open. Russia didn't expel its Jews. Russia expelled the Jews it had spent centuries trying to keep out. And unlike those other countries, Russia couldn't maintain its exclusion. The partitions of Poland brought Jews into the empire whether Russia wanted them or not. The challenge then became not how to keep Jews out, but how to manage the Jews who were already there. The answer was the Pale of Settlement. And the Pale became the framework within which Russian-Jewish relations unfolded for the next century and a quarter. The story of Jews in the Russian Empire after 1791 is too long and too complex to tell fully here. It includes moments of hope, like the reforms of Alexander II in the 1860s that allowed some categories of Jews to live outside the Pale: wealthy merchants, university graduates, skilled artisans, soldiers who had completed their military service. These exceptions created small Jewish communities in Moscow and St. Petersburg, professionals and businessmen who lived alongside their Christian neighbors. It includes periods of horrific violence, like the pogroms of the 1880s and 1900s that drove millions to emigrate. The images of those pogroms, of burning buildings and fleeing families, of Cossacks on horseback and mobs armed with clubs, became part of the global consciousness, symbols of the persecution that Jews had faced for centuries. It includes mass emigration on a scale unprecedented in Jewish history. The 2 million who went to America, the hundreds of thousands who went to other destinations, represented the largest voluntary migration of Jews since the expulsion from Spain. They carried with them the culture and language of the Pale, the memories of the old country, the determination to build new lives in new lands. It includes the rise of Jewish revolutionary movements, of Jews who concluded that the only answer to persecution was to transform society entirely. The Jewish Bund organized workers in the Pale. Jewish Bolsheviks like Leon Trotsky helped lead the Russian Revolution. The connection between Jews and revolutionary politics, real but exaggerated by anti-Semites, would fuel new waves of persecution in the 20th century. It includes Zionism, the movement to create a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Theodor Herzl was an Austrian journalist, but many of the early Zionist settlers were refugees from the Russian Empire, young men and women who had concluded that Jews would never be safe as minorities in other people's lands. They drained swamps and built kibbutzim, fought with Arabs and with the British, and eventually created the State of Israel. All of these developments, the emigration and the revolution, the cultural flowering, and the political movements, grew out of conditions in the Pale of Settlement. And the Pale grew out of the need to manage a Jewish population that Russia had never wanted but couldn't get rid of. And that need grew out of the partitions of Poland, which brought Jews into Russia just decades after Elizabeth had expelled them. And at the beginning of all of it, there was Elizabeth and her decree. There was a woman who believed that Jews were enemies of Christ, and that no prophet was worth tolerating their presence. There were 35,000 people forced from their homes. There was a policy that set Russia on a path it would follow for 2 centuries. Elizabeth's words echoed through all of it. Enemies of Christ. That was how she saw them, and that was how too many Russians continued to see them, long after anyone remembered who Elizabeth Petrovna was or what she had decreed. The Soviet Union, which replaced the Russian Empire after the revolutions of 1917, officially rejected religious discrimination. Jews could and did rise to prominent positions in the early Soviet state, but Soviet policy toward Jews was its own complicated story, with its own chapters of persecution, from the anti-cosmopolitan campaigns of the late Stalin era to the restrictions on Jewish emigration during the Cold War. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, roughly 1.5 million Jews still lived in Russia and the other successor states. Many of them emigrated in the years that followed to Israel, to America, to Germany. Today, the Jewish population of Russia is estimated at somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000, a tiny fraction of what it once was. The Jewish world that existed in Eastern Europe before 1939 is gone. The Holocaust destroyed most of it. A murdering 6 million Jews, erasing a civilization that had developed over centuries. The survivors and their descendants scattered across the globe. The shtetls are empty now, their synagogues converted to other uses or left to crumble, their cemeteries overgrown and forgotten. But before the Holocaust, before the Soviet Union, before the pogroms and the mass emigrations, there was Elizabeth and her decree. There was a moment when a ruler decided that Jews had no place in her empire and wrote 6 words that condemned tens of thousands to exile. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. The specific circumstances of 1742 are long past. The Russian Empire is gone. The world has changed in ways that Elizabeth could never have imagined. But the fears that drove her decree, the fear of the religious other, the fear of contamination and conversion, the willingness to sacrifice economic interests for ideological purity, these haven't disappeared from the world. Understanding why Jews were expelled from Russia in 1742 means understanding something about how societies decide who belongs and who doesn't. It means understanding how religious conviction can become political policy. It means understanding the gap between tolerance and acceptance, and how easily that gap can become a chasm. Elizabeth Petrovna believed she was doing God's work. She believed she was protecting her empire from spiritual corruption. She believed that the enemies of Christ had to be removed, regardless of the cost. And she acted on those beliefs with absolute conviction. Her 6 words still echo across the centuries. I do not wish any profit from the enemies of Christ. The question for every generation is who gets to define the enemies, and what we're willing to do to them once we have. But let us return once more to that December day in 1742 and consider what was lost. The Jews who were expelled from Russia that year and in the years that followed were not abstractions. They were not statistics. They were people. Individuals with names and faces, with hopes and fears, with families and businesses and communities they had built over years or generations. Consider what it meant to receive the news. You are a merchant in a small town in Little Russia. You have lived there for 20 years, perhaps 30. You know everyone in the town, Christian and Jew alike. You have extended credit to the local farmers. You have bought their grain and sold them cloth. You have attended their weddings and they have attended yours, standing respectfully outside the synagogue. You have raised your children here. Your parents are buried in the Jewish cemetery on the hill outside town, and now you learn that you must leave. Not because of anything you did, not because of any crime you committed, simply because of who you are. You have a few months to settle your affairs if you're lucky. You must collect the debts owed to you, though many debtors will suddenly become hard to find, or will claim they never borrowed anything. You must sell your property, though everyone knows you're desperate and will offer you a fraction of its value. You must decide what to take with you and what to leave behind, knowing that whatever you leave will be claimed by others the moment you're gone. You must say goodbye to everything you've known, the streets you've walked since childhood, the house where you brought your bride, the synagogue where you prayed every Sabbath, where your children were named and your parents were mourned, the graves you will never visit again. And then you must walk, with whatever you can carry, to the border. Guards will search you, looking for gold or silver they can confiscate. They will exchange your good Russian money for copper, worth far less. They will treat you like a criminal, though your only crime was being born. And when you finally cross into Polish territory, exhausted and impoverished, you must start over. Find a new community willing to accept you, or find a way to make a living in a place where you know no one, and no one knows you. Rebuild everything from nothing. This was the reality of Elizabeth's decree, not just words on paper, but lives disrupted and destroyed. Not just a policy, but a human catastrophe played out across tens of thousands of individual stories. And for what? What did Russia gain from the expulsion? The Senate had warned Elizabeth that the economic damage would be significant. They were right. Trade did suffer. The merchants of Riga did struggle. The complex commercial networks that Jews had built over generations were torn apart, and they were not easily replaced. But Elizabeth didn't care about economics. She had said as much in her famous marginal note. She didn't want profit from the enemies of Christ. The economic cost was irrelevant to her. What mattered was religious purity, the satisfaction of knowing that her empire was cleansed of Jewish presence, the conviction that she was doing God's will. In the end, of course, even that satisfaction proved temporary. Elizabeth's expulsion lasted only as long as Elizabeth's life. Within 3 decades of her death, Russia would acquire more Jews than it had ever expelled, millions of them through the partitions of Poland. The irony is profound. Elizabeth spent 20 years enforcing the most rigorous anti-Jewish policy in Russian history, and a generation later, Russia had the largest Jewish population in the world. All her efforts, all the suffering she caused, accomplished nothing in the long run. History swept past her decree as if it had never been written. But that doesn't mean the decree was without consequences. The Pale of Settlement, which confined Russian Jews for more than a century, was a direct response to the problem that the partitions created. And the partitions created that problem only because Russia had no framework for integrating Jews, no experience with Jewish presence, no institutions or attitudes that could accommodate a large Jewish population. If Russia had been more like Poland, if it had developed a tradition of Jewish residence and participation in society, the acquisition of Polish Jews might have been unremarkable. Jews would simply have continued doing what they had always done, living and working alongside their Christian neighbors, contributing to the economy and the culture of their country. But Russia had no such tradition. What Russia had was centuries of exclusion, culminating in Elizabeth's decree. When Jews suddenly appeared within Russia's borders, the only response Russian authorities could imagine was to contain them, to wall them off, to prevent them from spreading into the Russian heartland. The Pale of Settlement was, in a sense, the successor to Elizabeth's expulsion. Both were attempts to keep Russia free of Jewish influence. Elizabeth tried to achieve this by removing Jews entirely. Catherine and her successors tried to achieve it by confining Jews to a specific territory. The methods were different, but the underlying goal was the same, and both methods failed. Elizabeth's expulsion was undone by the partitions. The Pale of Settlement was undone by the emigration it helped create. The Jews who couldn't bear to live under Russian restrictions left, and they built new Jewish communities in America, and Palestine and elsewhere that proved far more enduring than anything in the Pale. Today, there are more Jews in the United States and Israel than ever lived in the Russian Empire. The great-grandchildren of those who fled the pogroms have become doctors and lawyers, professors and politicians, artists and entrepreneurs. They have shaped the culture and politics of their adopted countries in countless ways. They have kept alive the memory of the world that was destroyed, the world of the shtetl and the Pale, even as they have built new lives in new lands. Meanwhile, in Russia itself, Jews have dwindled to a tiny remnant. The community that once numbered in the millions now numbers in the hundreds of thousands at most. The synagogues that were crowded every Sabbath now struggle to find a minyan, the quorum of 10 needed for communal prayer. The Yiddish language that once echoed through the streets of Odessa and Vilna is now spoken only by scholars and the elderly. This is the ultimate legacy of Russian Jewish policy, from Elizabeth to the Soviet Union. Not the triumphant exclusion that Elizabeth sought, but the slow emptying of a Jewish presence that had existed for a millennium. Russia didn't expel its Jews in the end. It drove them away through persecution and restriction and violence until hardly any remained. Was this what Elizabeth wanted? In a sense, yes. She wanted Russia to be free of Jews. She wanted a Christian empire without enemies of Christ. If she could see Russia today, with its handful of Jews among a population of 140 million, she might consider her goal accomplished. But she would also see that the Jews didn't disappear. They went elsewhere. They built elsewhere. They thrived elsewhere. The people she expelled from Smolensk and Riga became the founders of communities in New York and Tel Aviv. The descendants of those who fled the Pale became Nobel laureates and Supreme Court justices, entrepreneurs and entertainers, scientists and statesmen. The Jews, whom Elizabeth called enemies of Christ, went on to transform the world. They contributed to every field of human endeavor, from physics to philosophy, from medicine to music, from business to the arts. They survived everything that was thrown at them, not just in Russia but across Europe, and they emerged as one of the most accomplished and resilient peoples in human history. Elizabeth's decree was meant to protect Russia from Jewish influence. Instead, it helped scatter Jewish influence across the globe. It was meant to ensure that Russia would never have to deal with Jews. Instead, it helped create the conditions that made dealing with Jews unavoidable for every major power in the modern world. This is perhaps the deepest irony of all. The expulsion, intended to eliminate a problem, actually helped spread that problem everywhere. The Pale, intended to contain Jewish influence, actually intensified Jewish identity and fostered the movements, Zionism and Jewish socialism and Jewish nationalism, that would reshape the Middle East and global politics. Elizabeth Petrovna, sitting in her winter palace, could never have imagined any of this. She saw Jews as a threat to be removed, but not as a people with a destiny that would unfold across centuries and continents. She thought in terms of her empire and her faith, not in terms of global history and the migrations of peoples. But history has a way of making fools of rulers who think they can control it. Elizabeth's decree was powerful within its time and place. It caused immense suffering to the people it affected. But in the long sweep of history, it was just one chapter in a much larger story, a story that was already old when Elizabeth was born, and that continues to this day. The Jewish people have outlasted every empire that persecuted them. They outlasted Babylon and Rome. They outlasted medieval Christendom and the Islamic caliphates. They outlasted the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. They have endured pogroms and expulsions, inquisitions and holocausts, and they are still here. Elizabeth's decree is now a footnote in history textbooks, remembered mainly by specialists and the descendants of those it affected. Elizabeth herself is a relatively obscure figure, overshadowed by her father Peter the Great and her successor Catherine the Great. The empire she ruled has vanished, replaced first by the Soviet Union and then by the Russian Federation. But the Jewish people remain, diminished by the Holocaust, scattered across the world, facing new challenges in every generation, but still here, still maintaining their faith and their identity, still contributing to the societies where they live, still remembering the places they came from, even when those places no longer exist. And that, perhaps, is the final answer to Elizabeth's decree. She wrote that she wanted no profit from the enemies of Christ, but the enemies she designated have prospered beyond anything she could have imagined. The people she expelled have built nations and won prizes and changed the world. The faith she rejected has survived intact, while the Byzantine Orthodox Christianity she championed has fragmented and declined. History has delivered its verdict on Elizabeth's policy, and it is not the verdict she expected. There is one more thing to say about the expulsion of 1742, and it concerns not the Jews who were expelled, but the Russians who expelled them. What did exclusion do to Russia itself? What did it mean for the Russian Empire and its successors to define themselves against the Jews, to make Jew hatred a central part of their identity? Some historians have argued that anti-Semitism was a kind of poison that corrupted Russian society from within. By teaching Russians to hate Jews, by encouraging them to see in Jews the source of all their problems, the government created patterns of thought that could easily be turned against other targets. The scapegoating mentality, the willingness to blame all misfortune on a despised minority, the belief that violence against outsiders was justified and even holy. These attitudes didn't stay confined to Jews. They spread through Russian society, affecting how Russians thought about all their problems. The pogroms of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, for example, were not just anti-Jewish violence. They were training exercises in mass murder, rehearsals for the kind of organized brutality that would characterize the Russian Civil War and the Stalinist terror. The Cossacks who massacred Jews in Kishinev in 1903 were practicing skills they would use against other enemies of the state in the years to come. The Black Hundreds, the proto-fascist movement that emerged in Russia in the early 1900s, directed their hatred primarily against Jews. But they hated other groups too: liberals, socialists, non-Russian nationalities. The ideology of hatred that anti-Semitism nurtured proved adaptable to many targets. And there is something else. By excluding Jews, Russia deprived itself of talents and contributions that might have enriched the empire. The Jews who were expelled or confined to the Pale included merchants and financiers, scholars and professionals, people whose skills and energy could have benefited Russian society. Instead, those talents went elsewhere, or were wasted in the grinding poverty of the shtetl. Consider what Jewish immigrants from the Russian Empire accomplished in America. Within a generation or two of arriving, penniless and speaking no English, their descendants were founding businesses, winning academic awards, contributing to every field of American life. The same drive and intelligence that they brought to America existed in their ancestors who lived under Russian rule. But Russia never allowed that potential to flourish. Some of Russia's greatest competitors benefited from Russia's loss. German Jews, who faced far less severe restrictions than Russian Jews, contributed enormously to German science and culture in the 19th century. American Jews, including millions who had fled from Russia, helped build the economic and cultural powerhouse that would become Russia's rival in the 20th century. The talent that Russia drove away enriched its competitors. This is another legacy of Elizabeth's decree and the policies that followed it. Russia weakened itself by excluding and persecuting Jews. It lost the contributions they might have made. It gained instead a reputation for backwardness and brutality that damaged its standing in the world. The pogrom became synonymous with Russia in the eyes of educated people everywhere, a symbol of everything that was wrong with the Tsarist regime. When the Russian Revolution came in 1917, many Jews supported it precisely because the old regime had treated them so badly. The revolutionary promise of equality, of an end to the Pale and the pogroms and the restrictions, appealed to people who had experienced nothing but persecution under the Tsars. That so many Jews became Bolsheviks was, in part, a consequence of Tsarist anti-Semitism. The empire created its own gravediggers by treating an entire people as enemies. This, too, is part of Elizabeth's legacy, though she could never have foreseen it. The hatred she championed, the exclusion she enforced, helped create the conditions for the revolution that would destroy the empire her family had built. We have traced a long arc in this story, from a Hebrew letter written in Kiev 1,000 years ago to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. We have followed the Jewish people through centuries of precarious coexistence, through the golden age of Polish Jewry and its catastrophic destruction, through the expulsion of 1742 and the Pale of Settlement, through pogroms and emigration and revolution and Holocaust. It is a story without a simple moral, without a neat resolution. The persecution of Jews in Russia was real and terrible, but it did not succeed in its goals. The Jews survived. Russia's empire did not. The people Elizabeth called enemies of Christ flourished in lands she never knew existed, while the church she championed declined and fragmented. But neither is this a triumphalist story. The survival of the Jewish people came at an enormous cost. 6 million murdered in the Holocaust. Millions more who died in pogroms and persecutions over the centuries. Communities destroyed, cultures erased, families scattered to the winds. The world of Eastern European Jewry, the world of the shtetl and the yeshiva, is gone and can never be recovered. And the hatred that drove Elizabeth's decree has not disappeared from the world. Anti-Semitism persists in Russia and elsewhere, sometimes dormant and sometimes virulent, always waiting for the next crisis to bring it back to the surface. The fears that Elizabeth articulated, the fear of the religious other, the fear of contamination, the belief that certain people are inherently enemies, these continue to poison societies around the world. So what can we learn from this history? What does the story of Russia and its Jews tell us about the human condition? Perhaps this, that exclusion and persecution are always costly, not just for the persecuted, but for the persecutors. That societies that define themselves against minority groups impoverish themselves morally and often materially as well. That hatred, once unleashed, is difficult to control and tends to spread to new targets. That the people we designate as enemies have a way of outlasting us. Perhaps also this, that ordinary people caught up in the policies of rulers suffer the consequences regardless of who was right or wrong in some theological or political dispute. The Jewish merchant expelled from his home in 1742 didn't care about the heresy of the Judaizers or the Leibov-Voznitsin case. He cared about his family, his livelihood, his community. He was punished not for anything he did, but for who he was. And perhaps this, that history is not determined by the powerful alone. Elizabeth signed her decree, and her decree was enforced by her officials and her soldiers. But the Jews who were expelled made their own choices, built their own lives, created their own futures. They were not merely victims, passive objects of persecution. They were actors in their own story, people who responded to catastrophe with resilience and creativity, who rebuilt what was destroyed and carried on. The granddaughter of a Jew expelled from Russia in 1742 might have lived in Warsaw or Vilna, might have seen the creation of the Pale of Settlement. Her great-granddaughter might have fled the pogroms of 1881, crossing the ocean to start anew in New York or Buenos Aires. Her great-great-granddaughter might have become a doctor or a lawyer, might have fought for civil rights or built a business, might have raised children who never knew the shtetl or the Pale except as stories the old people told. That chain of survival, that stubborn persistence across centuries and continents, is the real answer to Elizabeth's decree. You can expel a people from a territory. You cannot expel them from history. On December 2, 1742, Empress Elizabeth Petrovna signed a decree ordering the expulsion of all Jews from the Russian Empire. She wrote that she wanted no profit from the enemies of Christ. But the enemies she designated did not disappear. They went elsewhere. They survived. They built new lives, and new communities. They contributed to the world in ways that Elizabeth could never have imagined. And nearly 3 centuries later, their descendants tell this story. They remember what happened, they honor those who suffered, and they continue, as Jews have always continued, to affirm life in the face of those who would destroy them. Elizabeth's decree was powerful in its time. It caused immense suffering to real people. It shaped Russian history for generations. But in the end, it could not accomplish what it set out to do. It could not eliminate the Jews from history. It could not prevent them from flourishing. It could not silence their voices or erase their memory. The Empress is long dead. Her empire has vanished. Her decree is a historical curiosity, but the people she expelled are still here. That is the final word on the expulsion of 1742. That is the verdict of history on Elizabeth and her decree. The enemies of Christ, as she called them, have outlasted everything she built, and they will outlast everything built by those who come after her, who make the same mistakes, who designate new enemies, who believe that exclusion and persecution can ever truly succeed. History teaches us that they cannot. History teaches us that the persecuted endure. History teaches us that hatred destroys the hater as surely as the hated. Elizabeth Petrovna learned this lesson too late, if she learned it at all. But we can learn it from her example. We can see where her policies led, what they accomplished, what they cost. And we can choose differently. That is the purpose of history, not merely to record what happened, but to illuminate what might happen if we follow the same paths. The story of Russia and its Jews is a warning as much as a chronicle. It shows us where certain roads lead. The road Elizabeth chose led to the Pale of Settlement. It led to pogroms. It led to 2 million refugees fleeing across the ocean. It led to conditions that helped foment revolution. It led, ultimately, to the Holocaust. When the ideology of Jew hatred reached its logical conclusion in the death camps of Nazi-occupied Europe, there are other roads. There are societies that have welcomed minorities, that have benefited from diversity, that have treated all their people as members of a common community. Those societies have their own problems, their own failures, but they have not walked the road that Russia walked. The choice is always before us. Every generation, every society, every leader faces the question, how will we treat those who are different? Will we welcome them or exclude them? Will we see them as potential contributors or as threats to be eliminated? Will we build walls or bridges? Elizabeth chose walls. She chose exclusion. She chose to see in every Jew an enemy of Christ, a danger to her realm, a contamination to be removed. The results of her choice are now clear. The people she excluded survived and thrived. The empire she ruled collapsed. The church she defended fragmented. The policies she championed created misery for millions and benefited no one in the end. Her 6 words still echo. I do not wish any profit from the enemies of Christ. But profit, in the end, is not what matters. What matters is justice. What matters is humanity. What matters is recognizing in every person, regardless of faith or origin, a fellow human being deserving of dignity and respect. Elizabeth failed that test. Russia, for most of its history, failed that test. The question for us is whether we will fail it too. The story of the expulsion of 1742 is over. The story of humanity's struggle with prejudice and exclusion continues. May we learn from those who suffered. May we honor their memory by building a better world. And may we never again write in the margin of a government report that we want no profit from those we have chosen to call our enemies. For in the end, we are all diminished when we diminish others. We are all impoverished when we exclude and persecute. We are all weakened when we give in to hatred. Elizabeth's decree was a failure. May all such decrees fail. May the people they target survive and flourish. May the hatred that inspires them wither and die. That is the lesson of 1742. That is the message the Jewish people carry forward from their centuries of persecution. That is the hope that endures, despite everything, despite all the evidence to the contrary. Life persists. Love persists. The human spirit persists. And no decree, signed by any ruler, can ever truly destroy it. This documentary has told the story of one decree signed on one December day by one ruler who believed she was serving God. But it is also the story of a people who refused to be erased, a people who, when expelled from one land, built anew in another, a people who, when confined to ghettos and pales, created within those walls a civilization of learning and faith, a people who, when murdered by the millions, still produced survivors who rebuilt and remembered. The Hebrew word for this quality is davka, sometimes translated as despite everything, or specifically because. It captures the stubborn persistence of a people who have faced destruction again and again and have always found a way to continue. Elizabeth Petrovna signed her decree davka, specifically to eliminate Jews from her realm. The Jews survived davka, specifically because they refused to let her succeed. That is the story. That is the history. That is the truth that emerges from the archives and the chronicles, from the government reports and the community records, from the memories passed down through generations. On December 2nd, 1742, a woman sat alone in the Winter Palace and decided that an entire people had no place in her empire. She wrote 6 words that condemned tens of thousands to exile. Nearly 3 centuries later, her empire is dust. Her dynasty is extinct. Her church is diminished. But the people she called enemies of Christ are still here. They are still telling their story, and they will go on telling it, as long as there are human beings to listen and to learn. This has been the story of why Jews were expelled from Russia in 1742. But more than that, it has been the story of why such expulsions never truly succeed. It has been the story of hatred and its costs, of persecution and its failures, of the human spirit and its inexhaustible capacity for survival. May we remember, may we learn, and may we never forget. For the Jewish people have taught humanity something essential, that memory itself is a form of resistance. To remember those who suffered is to deny the persecutors their final victory. To tell the stories of the expelled and the murdered is to affirm that their lives had meaning, that their existence mattered, that they were not merely statistics in some ruler's decree. Elizabeth Petrovna wanted no profit from the enemies of Christ, but she could not prevent them from profiting from her hatred.